The Vatican did not fear war. It did not fear rebellion. It feared a book, older than Rome, bound in silence, and filled with forbidden truths. This Bible came from the mountains of Ethiopia, beyond the reach of empire, untouched by Latin councils. Inside were Gospels, the West erased, names the Church refused to speak, and a version of history carved not in scrolls but in stone. These were not myths. They were records, sealed, hidden, and still alive. Tonight, we step into a chapter of history the world was never meant to remember. You're here now. So settle in, close your eyes, and let the story speak. It arrived with no sound, no escort. Wrapped in coarse cloth, sealed in wax, the crate carried no flag, no label, just one faded line in ink, barely visible beneath layers of dust and time. Inside was a book that had no right to exist. Not because it was false, but because it was too true, and that truth didn't match the version Rome had worked centuries to protect. The man who received it was a Jesuit, quiet, careful, known for his steady hands and love of old texts. Father Luca had spent most of his life buried beneath the Vatican, in those endless rooms filled with forgotten manuscripts. He thought he'd seen everything. He hadn't. The parchment inside was impossibly old, but nearly perfect. The cover, strange, crafted from a material he didn't recognize, but it was the letters that stopped him cold. He recognized the script barely. Gaze, the sacred tongue of the Ethiopian Church, a language so ancient that only a handful could still speak it. As he turned the first page, his fingers began to shake. Not because of the age, but because of the order. Genesis was there, but not first. Before it was another book, a name he knew, but had never read in full. Enoch. The text the Vatican had rejected long ago. It spoke of angels who broke the rules of heaven, of forbidden knowledge, of watchers who taught mankind things no human was meant to know. Father Luca had seen mentions of Enoch before, small footnotes in old texts, whispered references in margins, but never this, never whole, never here. And then came another shock. Not just Enoch. There was Jubilees, Hermas, Tobit, even Mary's Gospel. Pages the councils of Carthage and Nicaea had scrubbed from the record, yet here they were, bound not as fragments, but as scripture, whole, alive, sacred. In Ethiopia, this wasn't hidden. This was the Bible. Luca closed the book and locked the door behind him. He didn't sleep that night. He didn't pray. He simply opened his journal, a habit from his days as a young seminarian, and wrote one line. This changes everything. The manuscript was resealed within 48 hours. No announcements, no debates, just silence. It was taken down into the lowest levels of the apostolic archive, below the catalogued volumes, beneath even the restricted collections. It wasn't destroyed. It wasn't even denied, just hidden, as if locking it behind iron doors might make it easier to forget. But it wasn't forgotten. Whispers stirred quietly within the curia. Some said Father Luca disappeared the following year. Others insisted he'd been sent quietly to a monastery in the Alps. No one could confirm where. No record was made, no farewell spoken. And the book? It was never logged, never assigned a number. But rumor says it still remains within those Vatican walls. Not because it's dangerous, but because it tells a story the Church can't explain. A story older than Rome. A Bible written in shadows. And still believed by millions. The rain had started before sunset. A steady, gentle storm, not the kind that crashes and roars, but the kind that wraps around stone and makes old walls breathe. The guards at the bronze doors didn't say a word. One shifted his weight. The other adjusted his coat. A cart rolled across the courtyard. No escort, no crest, no ceremony. Just one man, face hidden under a hood, pushing it slowly across the marble. Atop it, a crate bound in tarpaulin and rope. Inside the archive, the light was low. Lamps had burned down to flickers. The halls, already hushed, felt even heavier. In the restricted wing, deep beyond the marked sections, Father Luca waited. He'd been told something rare was coming. He hadn't been told from where. The hooded man said nothing. He placed a folder on the desk, nodded once, and vanished into the dark hall. Inside the folder was only a single note, written in Latin, stamped faintly with the papal seal. The handwriting, unfamiliar. The message, clear. for eyes only, not to be copied, not to be indexed. That's when Luca felt the first chill. The crate took nearly half an hour to unseal. The rope had tightened with moisture. His hands slipped more than once. When the lid finally gave way, he expected to see manuscripts, scrolls, perhaps a relic, but at first glance the crate seemed empty. Beneath layers of cloth and straw, however, was something else. A single book, ancient, red silk wrapped tight, tied with a simple cord. As he lifted it, the air changed. Still, heavy, like the room was holding its breath. He opened the book gently. The letters danced in sweeping lines, elegant, curved, strange, but not unknown. Gais, the liturgical language of Ethiopia. He turned slowly to the middle. The story it told didn't match the one he had lived his whole life protecting. In this book, Enoch walked among angels. Mary spoke not as a symbol, but as a prophet, and Revelation wasn't the end. Another text sat in its place, the Apocalypse of Peter. The order of the canon wasn't just different, it was reversed, and inside the final page, a loose letter, unfinished, no name, no seal, just one quiet line. If this is true, then our foundation is built on sand. That night, Father Luca placed the book in the deepest chamber. No logbook, no entry, just silence. And by morning the whispers had already reached the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The manuscript was no longer a curiosity, it was a threat. It's easy to believe that Rome was the beginning. The marble pillars, the Latin prayers, the echo of footsteps through the halls of St. Peter's. It all tells one story, a church built at the center of the world. But what if the center wasn't Rome? What if the oldest Christian truths don't lie beneath Vatican stone, but in the mountains of Africa? Long before the Vatican claimed power, before the first pope wore a crown, the people of Ethiopia were already writing their own sacred history. They didn't borrow it from Europe, they carried it with them, carved into stone, painted on parchment, sung in liturgies crafted from crushed flowers and memory. Their Bible wasn't edited by councils. It wasn't chosen by vote. It was preserved, protected, revered, and it was older. The Ethiopian Bible predates the Latin Vulgate. It came before the canon was settled by Western bishops, and it holds more books, dozens more. Not fragments, not fables, but full texts, read aloud for centuries by communities whose faith never passed through Rome. Some say it began with a royal gift. When the Queen of Sheba visited Solomon, she returned not just with wisdom and gold, but with something more powerful. She was pregnant. The child, Menelik, would grow into Ethiopia's first emperor. But more than that, he would carry home the teachings of Israel. Teachings that would root a form of Christianity untouched by European doctrine. And here lies the twist that unsettled the Vatican most. Because tradition says Menelik brought back more than stories. He brought the Ark of the Covenant. Rome called it impossible. Heresy. But no one went to check. No one was sent to see. They dismissed it. Not with denial, but with silence. Even as the Ethiopian church claimed it openly, guarding the Ark in a small chapel, watched over by a single monk who would never leave. The silence only deepened when scholars began comparing texts. The Ethiopian Bible included stories Western Christianity had buried, writings about fallen angels, about journeys beyond the sky, about women given prophetic voice. Not hidden, not sidelined, but central. These weren't myths. They were scripture, deeply rooted, faithfully kept, unbroken by time. One Vatican scholar, Father Bellini, once wrote a letter to a colleague. In it he said, "This is not a departure from our history. This is a different history entirely." That letter was never published. When Father Bellini died in 1968, the letter disappeared. In Rome, the archives stretch for miles, filled with books of every kind. But not all books are equal. Some are sealed in glass, some are never spoken of again, and some, the rarest ones, carry a quiet hum, a stillness that makes the walls lean in. This was never just a question of which Bible was first. It was a question of which truth was preserved, and why the one born in Ethiopia, older than Rome, deeper than doctrine, untouched by Europe, was hidden away in the dark beneath the Vatican. The pages felt smooth beneath his fingertips, aged. Yes, but strangely warm. Father Luca had held thousands of texts in the shadows of the Vatican library. But nothing like this. This book didn't whisper. Each page was hand-lettered in Gayes, black and red ink dancing between delicate borders kissed with gold. Just the artwork alone would have placed it among the Vatican's most precious treasures. But it wasn't the beauty that stopped Luca cold. It was what shouldn't have been there. He turned to the first strange entry with a breath that trembled just beneath his ribs. The Book of Enoch. Not a fragment. Not a passing quote. The full account. Here were the angels who descended to earth. The forbidden knowledge passed down to men. The punishments written in stars. This wasn't apocrypha. It wasn't hinted. It was complete, right between Genesis and Exodus, as if it had always belonged. And further still, more. Jubilees, Tobit, the apocalypse of Peter, and then something different. A gospel with no name. It opened not with a man, but a woman's voice. Steady, sorrowful, strong. The text hinted it was Mary herself, not standing silent at the edges, but teaching, daring truths the apostles could not. Father Luca's hands shook. These were not scraps. Not heresies hidden in shadows. They were scripture, read aloud in churches carved from mountain stone, cherished, protected, believed. And yet in Rome, those same pages had been buried for centuries. That morning he brought a single photocopy to his superior, Monsignor Diacros, a cold man, calculating, a guardian of doctrine more than faith. He read the page in silence. His eyes never lifted. When he reached the final line, I saw the Son of Man clothed in light, and he wept for the world that would forget him. He tore the page clean in half, dropped it into the fire. You didn't see this, he said, and if you speak of it again, you won't see this library either. Luca said nothing. But that night, he copied the passage again from memory. He placed it inside a wooden box beneath his bed. 10 years later, the box was found unopened beside his body. There are pages in every holy book that comfort, and there are pages that disturb, but the ones that truly frighten the church are the ones that do both. Pages that speak of angels and women, of truths older than councils, of a path once walked and then forgotten. Pages that even now, Rome refuses to name. But they exist. The name Enoch barely appears in the Bible, just a sentence, a whisper in the long scroll of Genesis. Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more. No sermons, no miracles, just silence. But in Ethiopia, that silence ends. The Ethiopian Bible doesn't hide the Book of Enoch. It honors it. Page after page of visions, of warnings, of secrets. In these writings, Enoch doesn't just walk with God. He's taken beyond the sky, beyond the stars, into realms where angels stand guard over the fate of the world. These angels are not soft or golden. They are called the Watchers. And what they watched, they were never meant to touch. They were sent to guide humanity, to protect, to teach. But something changed. The Watchers looked down and saw the daughters of men and desired them. They crossed the boundary. They descended. They took wives. They had children, giants, children of impossible size and strange knowledge. They taught humans how to forge weapons, mix potions, read the stars, cast spells, bend metal. They shared the secrets of heaven, and the world changed too fast. The Vatican has never accepted this version. Not officially, because if it's true, then not everything humans know came from divine grace or slow discovery. Some of it came from rebellion, from angels who fell. When the Vatican received its first full copy of the Ethiopian Book of Enoch in the early 20th century, it was placed in a quiet category, non-canonical studies, not banned, but not blessed. That was their way of saying, we won't speak of this, because we don't know how to. But inside the archives, the name Enoch kept resurfacing, in letters, in journal entries, in warning. One note, dated 1948, came from a cardinal who had translated part of the book by hand. It read, "This suggests a war in heaven before Genesis. If we accept that, then the creation story is not the beginning, it's the aftermath." Then came another surprise. The details in Enoch matched pieces of the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered shortly after, different cultures. Same story. The question shifted. It was no longer, is Enoch real? It became, who removed him? And why? In Ethiopia, he was never removed. The watchers are still spoken of. The visions are still sung. Enoch is still honored. But in Rome, his name lingers like smoke, too bold, too ancient, too full of memory. His book tells of a time before time, a fall before the fall, and a truth the Vatican may still be trying to bury. Not because it was wrong, but because it never stopped being right. In the long, silent corridors of the Vatican, where memory is written in dust and sealed behind stone, there is a story no one tells. Not because it was lost, but because it was never meant to be remembered. It doesn't begin in Rome. It begins in Jerusalem, in the age of King Solomon. Solomon, son of David, builder of the first temple, bearer of wisdom. Scripture says he ruled in peace. But in the hills of Ethiopia, another story lives, kept alive in a book the Vatican has always kept at arm's length. The Kebra according to this sacred Ethiopian chronicle, older than most Western historians will admit, the Queen of Sheba travelled not just out of curiosity, but under divine instruction. She left Jerusalem with treasure, wisdom, and something else. She carried a child. That child, Menelik, would become Ethiopia's first emperor. But the claim doesn't stop there. It says Menelik carried Solomon's blood. One line, one legacy. But it changes everything. Because if it's true, then Ethiopia, not Europe, holds the direct royal line of the House of David, and that would mean the divine right to rule, once claimed by kings and popes, had already passed, quietly, completely into African hands. In the 13th century, Ethiopian priests brought copies of the Kebra to Jerusalem. One letter, now buried deep in the Vatican, describes a Franciscan monk who saw the scrolls. He wrote urgently to Rome. They say Solomon's throne was never empty, only moved. That the church sits in the wrong place? This wasn't just political, it was theological. If Menelik truly carried the blood of Solomon, then Ethiopian emperors had both royal and priestly power. They were kings by lineage, shepherds by divine right, and that would place them above any European crown, above any pope. Some in the Vatican called the claim a fable. Others weren't so sure. In 1915, a sealed report arrived from a Jesuit missionary stationed at court in Ethiopia. He had witnessed a ritual. A scroll wrapped in gold, whispered blessings, passed from priest to king. He was told it came from Solomon himself, but he was never allowed to see what was written inside. Within 5 years, the missionary left the church, quietly, without explanation. To this day, the Vatican doesn't speak of Solomon's line, but in Ethiopia, it is still honored. Not with crowns, but with stone, with chant, with stories carved into the sides of mountains. And maybe that is what troubled Rome most. That far from the cathedrals, beyond the marble and the law, an ancient bloodline still breathes. Unbroken, unbent, untouched by Western hands. High in the northern mountains of Ethiopia, there is a place where the earth opens, not to bury the dead, but to lift up the sacred. A place where stone doesn't rise toward the sky, but sinks into it. Where churches were not built, but carved, by hand, in silence. The town is called Lalibela, and for centuries, its very existence has made the Vatican uneasy. There are 11 churches in Lalibela, each one carved from a single block of volcanic rock, hollowed top to bottom. Walls, columns, altars, archways, all shaped inside the earth, as though remembered from some ancient dream. No scaffolding, no blueprints, no wood, just chisel, hammer, and prayer. Ethiopian tradition says the churches were built in the 12th century, commissioned by King Lalibela after he saw a vision of a second Jerusalem. Angels guided the work, and while the men slept at night, the angels continued carving. Within 24 years, the churches stood complete, hidden in plain sight. The Vatican first heard of Lalibela through Portuguese missionaries in the 1500s. Their reports were strange, uneasy. It wasn't just the structures, it was what happened inside them. Priests chanting in gayas, incense curling through tunnels of carved stone, ancient liturgies echoing against rock walls older than cathedrals in Rome. And beneath it all, a pattern. From above, the layout of the churches wasn't random. It formed a map. Some said it mirrored Jerusalem. Others believed it reflected the heavenly design described in the Book of Enoch. That same book Rome had spent centuries rejecting. One Jesuit returned from Lalibela with drawings, diagrams of the church layout, but he was told not to publish them. His notes were taken, his report quietly shelved. But they still exist, handwritten, faded, buried in the Vatican's restricted architecture archive. Years later, a Vatican archaeologist visited Lalibela under another project name. Officially, he was there to study construction methods. But his private notes tell a different story. Inside the walls, he claimed to find marking symbols not in Latin but in ancient Hebrew and early Coptic. He described a sealed chamber beneath one of the chapels, a stone slab with no hinges, no lock, no handle, and in his final note, a single line. It is not that these churches were carved in stone. It is that they were carved from memory. The Vatican never spoke of his findings, and no more expeditions were sent. But in Lalibela, the silence remains. The air still smells of stone and incense. Pilgrims still walk barefoot through trenches of cooled earth. Prayers still echo in the dark, and the churches cut from rock, sung into being, still keep their mystery, not above the earth, but deep beneath it, where even the light must bow. There are marks carved deep into the churches of Lalibela, etched into stone pillars, painted across faded manuscripts, stitched into the robes of ancient priests. At first they seem simple, a star, a cross, a flame. But the longer you look, the more they begin to shift. Not in form, but in meaning. Because these aren't decorations, they're messages, and some, the Vatican cannot explain. When Jesuit missionaries first walked the halls of Ethiopia's churches in the 16th century, they expected fragments of Christian truth, traces left behind, worn down by time. What they found instead was something whole, something complete. The symbols weren't Roman. There were no golden halos, no Latin inscriptions. Instead, there were 12 pointed crosses, wings with 6 eyes, spirals within stars, letters that danced in curves and loops. When they asked the priests what they meant, the answers were soft. Some symbols, they were told, were too sacred to speak. Others were older than memory itself. Back in Rome, the sketches were sealed in private files. Over the next 3 centuries, scholars tried to decode them. One believed they came from Jewish mysticism. Another claimed they were borrowed from early Egyptian churches. A third saw clear links to the Book of Enoch, symbols tied to the Watchers. But none of the answers settled the matter, because for every explanation, more questions rose. In 1928, a Vatican librarian named Father Gianni was given rare access to a small, uncatalogued set of Ethiopian manuscripts. Among them, one stood out, a list of symbols, each one followed by lines of gaze and what appeared to be instructions. One design, 3 interlocked circles surrounding a single flame, was marked by a word Gianni had never seen. He sent a copy to the Office for the Doctrine of the Faith. 3 weeks later, he was reassigned. The manuscript disappeared. Decades later, a French researcher studying Christian iconography claimed to find the same symbol carved into the walls beneath the Vatican, near the necropolis under St. Peter's Basilica. He asked for access to compare photos. He was denied. No explanation. Only a letter saying the area was under restoration. But in Lalibela the symbols remain. Pilgrims still touch them before prayer. Monks still draw them in the margins of sacred texts. No one tries to explain. They remember. In the West, a symbol must be translated to have value. In Ethiopia, a symbol only needs to be remembered. And that may be the mystery Rome cannot solve. These marks in stone don't speak to Latin. They speak to something older, something deeper. A truth carried not through councils or creeds, but through silence, gesture, and faith. Beneath the red earth of Ethiopia, there is a tunnel almost no one speaks of. It doesn't appear on maps. It isn't named in records, but it exists, cut from stone, hidden from light, and said to connect 2 worlds that were never meant to meet. In 1931, farmers near Lalibela were digging a channel during a long dry season. One struck hollow. It wasn't a cave. It was a corridor, angled perfectly, lined with smooth walls, faint inscriptions in gaze. No stairs, no doors. Just the sound of footsteps fading into the dark. Local priests sealed the site quickly, but one boy slipped in before they could. A merchant's son. He followed the tunnel with only a torch in his hand. It stretched for nearly half a mile. At the end he found a chamber, small, stone, beneath a monastery, and on a pedestal covered in dust lay a single book, leather-bound, written, not in Dian, but in Latin. Years later, the boy, now a man, told a French historian what he had seen. The book wasn't a Bible. It was a journal, a traveler's notes, not from a missionary, but a scholar, a man who had come to study and who never left. In the margins, he described rituals he had witnessed, chants, prayers, ceremonies. And what disturbed him most was how familiar they were. Too familiar. Same structure, same sacred order, even the same symbols. And on the final page, a single line. I believe this tunnel once linked our churches before the councils, before the division, before the silence. The Vatican never acknowledged the tunnel. But in 1974, a quiet request was filed. The Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples asked to send a private team to Lalibela. The Ethiopian Church denied it. They said the passage was sacred, not for study, only for memory. The Vatican didn't press. To this day, the entrance is sealed with stone, hidden beneath vines. But among the older priests in Lalibela, a saying remains. It's not spoken aloud, only in prayer. The church was never divided by land, only by memory. And, perhaps deep under the earth where emperors and popes never tread, there still lies a doorway, carved not in conquest, but in peace. A passage history forgot, but the stones did not. His name was Father Elio Dalba. Quiet, soft-spoken, eyes that noticed everything, voice rarely louder than a breath. He was a Vatican-trained linguist, fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. But in his final years, it was the ancient tongue of Ethiopia, Ge'ez, that consumed him. In 1969, he was sent to Ethiopia. Officially, it was a liturgical study. The goal, to compare Ethiopian chants with early Roman hymns, to trace common ground, maybe nudge their theology closer to Rome. But those who knew him said his purpose ran deeper. He didn't want to align traditions. He wanted to understand why they ever separated. For nearly 5 years, he lived in the monastery of Debradamo, a place beyond roads, reachable only by rope, silence wrapped around the cliffs, stone cells, candlelight, devotion carved into every wall. The monks trusted him. They believed he wasn't there to convert or correct. And slowly, something shifted. He stopped studying from the outside. He began listening from within. He kept a journal, by hand, by candle, sketches of symbols he couldn't explain, translations of texts Rome had never seen. And then came the final entry. It was hidden in the lining of his travel bag, found only after his death. The page was torn, the handwriting shaky, edges darkened like it had been written in haste. This morning I was shown the book. Not a copy, not a translation, the book itself. He described it, bound in deep red leather, too old to date. Pages with the scent of frankincense. The monks called it the memory of fire. They told him it was not to be read, only to be heard. And so, they sang it to him. A liturgy not found in any Vatican archive. The words he wrote came like wind through stone. It spoke of a time before division, before language fractured the church, before power sat on thrones. It told of a covenant not broken, only moved. And in the margin, one line, written in both Ge'ez and Latin. The ark was never lost, only hidden. That was the last sentence he ever wrote. 3 days later, he was found kneeling by the cliff, hands folded, eyes closed. No sign of illness, no struggle, just stillness. The Vatican recovered his body, but made no mention of his work. His journal, aside from the final page, was never returned. The monks said nothing, only offered a quiet blessing. In Ge'ez, some say he found peace. Others believe he found something more, a truth too deep for Rome, too holy for paper. And maybe that's what frightened the church most. Not that he lost his faith, but that he found it. The first thing you notice is the scent. Before your eyes adjust to the dark, before your ears catch the rhythm of ancient chant, you smell it. Sweet, sharp, sacred, frankincense burning low in a bronze censer, swinging slowly from the hand of a barefoot priest. And beneath that, older still, the scent of carved stone, warmed by centuries of breath and prayer. Here, in the highlands of Ethiopia, nothing is rushed. The stone around you feels ancient, cold, but alive. Carved not by tools, but by time. It doesn't shine, it breathes. Sunlight doesn't pour in through colored glass. It sneaks in through slivers in the rock, warm and golden, brushing the walls like memory. Shadows drift across the floor like they have somewhere to be. The air carries a scent that never changes: fire and dust, old prayer and older earth. Western scholars who come here often describe the feeling as if stepping outside of time. But for those who live within these walls, time never went anywhere. Every morning, they wake to chants that haven't changed in over 1,000 years. The words rise and gaze, a language older than Latin, once studied by the Vatican, but never fully held. The sound doesn't climb or impress. It lingers. It hums from below, as if it comes not from the mouth but from the ground beneath your feet. In 1961, a bishop from Italy spent 3 nights in a remote monastery not far from Axum. He was welcomed with respect, shown the ancient church, and invited into prayer. At first he felt disoriented. There were no pews, no painted murals, no polished marble. The icons were worn, darkened from centuries of candlelight. But then, something changed. During a midnight vigil, a boy stepped forward, no older than 12, barefoot, silent, holding a vessel of burning incense. The bishop would later write in a private letter, "The boy moved without making a sound, except for the soft clink of the censer swinging, and in that moment he felt it. The smoke carried something deeper than scent. It carried truth, not the truth you speak, but the kind you remember without knowing how." He returned to Rome and never mentioned what he'd seen, not publicly. The twist, as always, isn't in what happened, but in what followed. Not long after, his name was quietly removed from a Vatican committee on liturgical reform. His papers were archived, and the smell of frankincense that once filled his memory was replaced by polished floors and distant echoes inside St. Peter's Basilica. But in the stone churches of Ethiopia, nothing shifted. The priests still rise before sunrise. The incense is still lit with coals passed down from the fire of the day before, and the prayers, slow and steady, drift upward like smoke, learning how to fly. There are no recordings of these moments. No cameras are allowed. But for those who have stood in that silence, they carry it with them. Not as proof, as a secret. Because that scent, that blend of ash and stone and sacred flame, is more than ritual. It's a story, one older than Rome, burning quietly in the dark, where words end, and only memory remains. In every grand cathedral, every hidden monastery, and every quiet chapel, where the flicker of a candle lights the turning of old pages, one question echoes louder than any bell. What counts as canon, and who decides? Canon isn't just a list of accepted books, it's a border drawn in ink between what's called truth and what's labeled heresy. It separates what is remembered from what is left to disappear. Canon is the official voice of a belief system, preserved, protected, and enforced by those in power. But behind that voice, there have always been others, whispers, questions, quiet doubts in dark corners. Is the canon complete, or is something missing? In the Western Church, the canon of the Bible was officially finalized during the Council of Trent in the 1500s. It was a time of division and reform. Protestant leaders were challenging long-standing authority, translating scripture into common languages, and removing certain books they deemed unnecessary or false. The Vatican responded by holding the line, defining which texts were to be called sacred and which were not, once and for all. But the truth is, it wasn't really once, and it wasn't really all. That decision came late. For more than 1,000 years, different Christian communities followed different collections of scripture. Some included the Book of Enoch, others, the Book of Jubilees. Some preserved Gospels that spoke of Mary and other early disciples, voices barely heard in the Western canon. The Ethiopian Church had already been practicing Christianity long before the Council of Trent ever met. Their Bible was not trimmed to match Rome's. It included these books, and still does. That's where the questions begin. When Jesuit scholars first traveled to Ethiopia, they expected to find a simplified version of faith. What they found instead was something older. Their hosts carried heavy, hand-bound Bibles, written in gaze, filled with texts the West had long dismissed. These weren't additions, they had always been there, preserved from the start. And suddenly, the problem was no longer theoretical. If these books had survived in Ethiopia from the earliest days of Christianity, then what had Rome erased? A letter written in 1694 by a Jesuit priest captured this quiet panic. After reading the Book of Enoch, he wrote, "If this is true, then the angels have fallen, and humanity has remembered. Rome has no room for that kind of memory. That letter was never published. It still rests today, sealed and silent, somewhere deep in the Vatican archives. But Ethiopia remained unchanged, unshaken, because for them, canon is not a wall. It's a doorway, a wide one. It welcomes stories of angels and visions, wisdom once called forbidden. It does not hide them, it honors them. And that's what makes the question so dangerous. What is canon? Who gets to decide? Because sometimes the most unsettling truths aren't the ones we read, but the ones we never got to. The story doesn't stop with missing books. It begins there. For centuries before Rome sealed its list, believers in different lands held on to different sacred texts. Some knew the letters of Paul, others followed writings like the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, or the Gospel of Mary. These weren't side stories, they were scripture. In the deserts of Egypt and the mountains of Ethiopia, these texts were copied by hand, shared with care, and passed from parent to child. There were no printing presses, no declarations of heresy, just the belief that truth would find its way. But as Rome's influence spread, so did a growing fear. Too many voices could lead to confusion. Too many stories might pull the faithful in too many directions. The church, now rising in power, began to draw lines. Councils were held, first in Laodicea in the 4th century, then in Carthage. Leaders debated not just theology, but which words should live and which should vanish. Some books were praised, others removed quietly, without ceremony. And when the Council of Trent convened more than 1,000 years later, it locked the list for good. No additions, no reconsideration, just a final stamp. The books left out were labeled apocrypha, or worse, heresy. They faded from the shelves of Europe. But in Ethiopia, they remained untouched, revered, alive. That's what makes the Ethiopian Bible not just old, but dangerous. It remembers too much. It carries the parts that others tried to forget. In 1673, a Jesuit priest stationed deep in the Ethiopian highlands wrote a report, never meant for public eyes. Years later, it was found in a sealed trunk, still smelling faintly of ash and ink. He described a ceremony in which monks recited long passages from the Book of Jubilees. But it wasn't the priests who surprised him, it was the people. The villagers responded to every word, not as outsiders, but as if the stories were their own. These are not rebels, he wrote. They are keepers of what we lost. Their prayers carry echoes we once silenced. But silence in the West didn't always come softly. In France, entire libraries were burned during the Albigensian Crusade, because they held so-called dangerous texts. In Spain, during the Inquisition, copies of banned Gospels were seized and destroyed. In Italy, some manuscripts were hidden away in monasteries, locked behind orders never to be translated, and yet, somehow they were never fully erased. Even within the Vatican's own archives, some of these forbidden works still exist, not catalogued, not studied, just kept. Some sealed in red wax, others stamped with old Latin warnings. Do not read, do not open. But the fire never reached Ethiopia. The books were never burned, they were held close. And today, centuries later, they offer something rare. A light not meant to dazzle or burn, but to reveal a different kind of truth. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a book can do is survive. She was there from the beginning. At the cross, at the empty tomb, in the upper room where the wind moved like breath through silence. Mary Magdalene, her name whispered in every corner of the early church. She wasn't just a witness, to many, she was the messenger, the first to carry the news, the apostle to the apostles. And yet, in the long scroll of Rome's sacred writings, her voice began to fade until one day it disappeared. But not everywhere. In the highlands of Ethiopia, in a monastery untouched by modern time, one book remained. Its pages were sewn by hand. The ink had browned with age, but its voice was steady, clear. A gospel not of Peter, not of John, but of Mary. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene was never part of the canon chosen by Rome. Not because of what it said, but because of who said it. In this gospel, Mary doesn't sit quietly at the edge of history. She speaks, she teaches, she describes visions of the soul's journey after death, and she is not challenged by enemies. She is questioned by those closest to Jesus. In one moment, Peter asks why the teacher would speak to her privately and not to the rest of them. Mary answers without anger, without force, only peace. Her tone holds no fire, just sorrow, as if she already knew how the story would be retold and how her part in it would be erased. The Vatican has never accepted this gospel. For centuries it was believed lost, surviving only in broken fragments, hidden in desert caves. But in the early 20th century, something changed. A full copy written in gaze was found in an Ethiopian monastery near Lake Tana. Unlike the crumbling pieces found in Europe, this version was complete. It had been read aloud during services for generations. It had never been hidden. A Jesuit missionary named Father Lucien was the first outsider to hear it spoken. He kept a journal. In one entry he wrote, "They speak of Mary the way we speak of Paul, not as a helper, as a founder. Her words are not ornament. They are foundation." He sent a request to the Vatican to study the gospel more closely. The response came quickly. His mission ended. He was called back to Rome. He was never reassigned. But the manuscript? It stayed. The monks refused to hand it over. They called it the voice beneath the silence. For them, Mary was not erased. She was remembered. In every hymn sung by candlelight. In every story whispered from grandmother to child. She was not background. She was beginning. And maybe that's the one thing Rome could never explain. In its libraries, the Gospel of Mary exists only in scattered pieces. But in Ethiopia, it still lives. Her voice, once silenced by councils, now speaks from mountain stone and midnight prayer, not with power, but with truth. Soft, steady, and dangerous, not because it rebels, because it remembers. In the quiet halls of the Vatican, where marble floors echo beneath robes and shadows dance on ancient stone, there is a truth too fragile to speak aloud. The Bible, at least the one the world knows, was not just translated, it was reshaped. The word rewritten is uncomfortable. But in the early centuries of the Church, Scripture wasn't one book. It was a collection of scrolls, scattered across lands and languages, stories of Jesus, letters from apostles, visions of angels, carried on foot, copied by hand, passed from believer to believer. No two copies were ever exactly the same. The first Christians weren't editors, they were gatherers, carriers of wonder. But as the Church grew, so did its fear. Too many voices, too many versions, too much freedom. Rome wanted order, and with order came decisions. Councils were formed, bishops gathered, not just to debate theology, but to choose which stories would last forever, and which would vanish into silence. By the time of the Council of Trent in the 1500s, the Bible was closed. The list was final. No new Gospels, no additions, no space for forgotten scrolls. But centuries before that seal, a man named Jerome was given a task to create a single, official version of Scripture, a Bible for Rome. Working from Hebrew, Greek, and early Latin texts, Jerome assembled what would become the Vulgate, the foundation of the Roman Bible. But he didn't simply translate. He made choices. He changed the order of books. He left some out. He added commentary, notes in the margins, warnings. He called the Book of Enoch dangerous, the Shepherd of Hermas fiction. His edits, made in silence, far from any crowd, would echo through every generation that followed. The Vatican never hid this part of history, but it never lingered there either. In Ethiopia, things were different. Their scriptures weren't rewritten to match Rome's. Their canon wasn't trimmed to fit a Western mold. It remained wide, strange, and holy. They kept Enoch, they kept Jubilees, they kept Mary's Gospel, they kept what the West forgot. They treated their Bible not as a monument to perfection, but as a living memory. In 1971, a Vatican scholar working in the archives found something curious. Handwritten notes tucked inside a weathered Latin Bible. The ink had faded, but the message was clear. A bishop in the 12th century had once met an Ethiopian monk on pilgrimage. In the margins, he scribbled a line. "Their Bible is wild, but it burns with truth. Ours is polished. Theirs is alive." That note was never published. And maybe that's the real mystery. Not what was left in, but what was left out. Not which stories were saved, but who got to choose. Because the rewriting of the Bible wasn't a single decision. It was a slow war, a quiet battle fought with ink and sealed with power. a battle remembered only in whispers. And yet in Ethiopia, the older path remains. The pages still turn. Barefoot, unchanged, carried by memory. And that is what Rome fears most. Not heresy, but the truth it chose to leave behind. In the scorched landscapes of Ethiopia, far from the carved churches of Lalibela, beyond the reach of cardinals and councils, there are caves the Vatican has never entered. These aren't marked on tourist maps. No bells ring there. No hymns echo through stone corridors. These caves breathe only silence. But inside them, behind walls of loose rock and faded goat-hide curtains, lie books. Books the world was never meant to find. For centuries, desert monks have come to these caves, not to flee the world, but to protect it. They carry no swords. They wear no armor. What they guard is older than kingdoms, and more dangerous than gold. They guard words. These aren't library scrolls. They're not catalogued or preserved behind glass. They're wrapped in linen, tucked into crevices, handed from elder to student with quiet instruction. Never sell, never copy, never reveal. Each one tells a different story. One speaks of angels teaching humans forbidden knowledge. Another describes Mary Magdalene's journey through Egypt. Still another contains a vision of the sky tearing open, not for judgment, but for memory. In 1932, during a sandstorm in the Danakil Depression, a European traveller was taken in by a desert monk. The monk offered him shelter, water, and a warning. Do not ask about the books. But the traveller asked anyway. Later that night, the monk returned. In his hands a charred bundle wrapped in palm leaves. He didn't open it. He only said, "This one was not written on earth." It was remembered. The traveller wrote about this encounter in his journal. The notes were eventually sent to a university in France, where they gathered dust until word quietly reached Rome. No official inquiry was announced, but something moved. In 1977, a Vatican archivist named Father Borgia wrote a private letter to a colleague. In it, he revealed that a group of unclassified manuscripts from Ethiopia had arrived in Rome. The language, J's, the contents, nearly identical to fragments believed lost forever, parts of the Book of Noah. But the surprise wasn't what the book said, it was what it didn't. There was no mention of Peter, no acknowledgement of Rome, just a steady, unshaken voice. A voice that spoke across centuries of silence without asking permission, without needing approval. The Vatican never confirmed the texts. Since then, no missions have been approved for the Danakil region. Officially, the caves hold no religious interest, but the monks remain. The candles still burn, and the books, wrapped in shadow and memory, still rest where they were first hidden, not behind glass, not in Rome, but in stone, waiting. In the early months of 1625, beneath a moon just past full, a sealed letter was delivered by hand to a Jesuit priest named Father Matteo Serrano. He was not a scholar, not a theologian. He had no title of great rank. He was chosen for one reason: he obeyed. The instructions were never spoken aloud, only written in a folded parchment, closed with a red wax seal, bearing a symbol not used in any Roman order. A cross, but not Rome's. His mission was simple: travel to the highlands of Ethiopia, find the source of the theological divide, and if necessary, correct it. The letter was to be opened only after he had passed beyond familiar borders. Even among his Jesuit companions, the operation had no name, only a code: Lux Caecus, the blind light. He arrived in Massawa by ship, then rode inland on mule, following old trade paths carved by pilgrims and merchants. He spoke little, kept to his journals. When asked about his presence, he replied only, "I am studying the light." But light was never what he sought. It was a book, a text rumored to contain words not found in any Western canon. A book said to challenge Rome's understanding of the Trinity itself, and the Vatican wanted it recovered, or destroyed. Locals were cautious. They had seen men like him before. Some brought blessings, others brought fire. In the town of Adwa, he was given shelter in a monastery carved into the mountainside. The monks were kind, but distant. They disappeared often, returned with ash on their foreheads and silence in their eyes. And then he saw it. The book, bound in leather, clasped with iron, written in gaze. The words moved like water. He could not read them. but he could feel what followed when the monks turned its pages. The silence wasn't absence, it was reverence. Years later, a letter was found in a forgotten Vatican drawer, never sent, unsigned, written in Father Matteo's hand. In it, he wrote, "I was sent to correct a gospel, but what I found was a gospel unbroken. They have not lost Christ. They have remembered him differently. He never returned. Some say he died of illness. Others believe he chose to stay disappearing into the rhythm of monastic life. A man who came to convert and was converted. The Vatican marked the mission as incomplete. The file was closed. No further detail given. But in that mountain monastery they still remember. Each year, on the day he arrived, they light a single candle in a small room. No prayers are spoken aloud. No songs are sung. Only one book is opened. Not to be rewritten, not to be corrected, only to be read. The city of Axum was still that morning. The sun had barely touched the stone streets, and the tall stelae stood silent, like ancient guards watching the past. The scent of coffee, of earth, and of slow-burning incense filled the air, as it always had. But that day something was different. Beneath a crooked fig tree at the eastern gate, two men stood facing one another. One wore the pale robes of an Ethiopian monk, the other the dark cassock of a Vatican envoy. They did not speak. No record exists of their meeting. It was never written into any journal or report. But what passed between them would shape the future of both churches. The monk's name is lost. Some say he was a guardian, one of those sworn to protect sacred texts. Others whisper that he had once been a Roman priest who disappeared during a mission, only to reappear years later in Ethiopia, changed and unreadable. The envoy was Father Aldo Marchesi, sent under direct orders. His task was not a pilgrimage. It was a recovery, a quiet mission to retrieve manuscripts, believed to contain early Christian texts, long erased from the Western canon. But his instructions came with a warning. This was not only about scripture, there was a deeper concern, a fear that the Ethiopian church was not a distant branch of Rome, but something older, something equal. The night before the fig tree meeting, Father Marchesi had been invited into a small mountain church. There, beneath a sloped roof, blackened by centuries of smoke, the monk showed him a book, wrapped in linen, sealed with wax. Inside were words he had never seen, prayers unlike anything taught in Rome. They spoke of a time when heaven walked with earth, when Christ was not only in Galilee, but near the Red Sea. The list of apostles was different. The structure of the church itself was different. No mention of Peter's primacy, only of unity. Broken. The next morning, Marchesi returned. With guard, he demanded the book. The monk said nothing, only closed the manuscript and stepped back. What happened next was never fully told. By sundown, the church doors were locked. The book was gone. The guards were seen leaving with a heavy case, covered in cloth. That night, Father Marchesi vanished. Some said he fled, ashamed of what he had done. Others whispered he never left Axum, that what he carried was not just paper and ink, but something far heavier, that the monk's silence had not been surrender. It had been a warning. The Vatican never acknowledged the incident. In official records, Marchesi was quietly reassigned with no post. The sealed case was never located, but in Axum, the fig tree still stands, and the locals still place stones at its base, not as grave markers but as reminders that even where faith is strong, trust can be broken, and some things once taken cannot be carried. Deep within the archives of the Vatican, beneath layers of dust, marble, and forgotten catalogue numbers, there's a drawer with no name. It doesn't appear on the public index. It's not listed in any tour. Inside, tied together with a ribbon of faded silk, a letter. No stamps, no replies, just words that were never sent. They were written by Father Domenico Fina, a Jesuit scholar stationed in Gondar during the late 1700s. His mission, according to church records, was simple: observe the rites of the Ethiopian church and report any theological errors. At first, that's what he did. But something changed. The longer he stayed, the more uncertain he became. Not about them, but about himself. What began as a report became a confession. The letters were all addressed to the Jesuit Superior General, the man known within church circles as the Black Pope. But these weren't formal updates. They were personal, quiet, raw. His writing was careful, measured, but just beneath the surface, there was something else. A man unraveling. He wrote of liturgies older than anything he'd studied in Rome, of children singing psalms from books, never translated into Latin. He described icons that showed Christ with stars and wings, symbols unfamiliar, circles within circles, visions more ancient than dogma. In one letter dated March 5th, 7, I no longer believe we were sent to correct them. I believe we were sent to keep them from correcting us. But here's the twist. None of these letters ever left Ethiopia. They were found, unopened, in a satchel, discovered behind a false panel, in the Vatican storage vaults during renovations in 1954. The satchel had been hidden so deliberately that archivists thought it was part of the wall. Inside, they expected maps or old translations. Instead, they found a man's quiet collapse. One letter was sealed in wax, but not with any Vatican symbol. It bore 3 interwoven crosses. Inside, Father Domenico described a meeting with a senior Ethiopian priest. The man had shown him a single page from a codex long believed lost in the West, the Book of the Mysteries of Heaven and Earth. The priest claimed the book had been hidden since the 4th century, not to conceal it in fear, but to preserve it in faith. At the end of the letter, Domenico wrote just one line. If this truth is ever known, it will not come through debate. It will come through memory. Why were the letters never mailed? Was he silenced? Or did he choose silence himself, knowing some truths can't be explained, only held? The Vatican made no official comment when the letters were found. They were quietly refiled. No title, no summary. But the words remain. And in that silence, something still speaks. Not rebellion, not defiance, just a voice, older than fear, still whispering. The air at Debre Libanos was unusually still that morning in May, as if even the earth was waiting. The monastery carved into the cliffs north of Addis Ababa had stood for centuries, a place of silence, of memory, of prayer. But in 1937, that silence was shattered. Not by bells, not by chanting, but by gunfire. The Italian occupation of Ethiopia had already brought terror to the land, but what happened at Debre Libanos left a wound so deep, even time steps around it. More than 2,000 monks, students, and pilgrims had gathered for the annual commemoration of the monastery's founding. Most had walked for days carrying nothing but bread and belief, but they weren't alone. Italian troops, acting on orders from General Pietro Maletti, surrounded the monastery. The official claim? A suspected link between the clergy and an attempt on the life of the Italian viceroy. The Vatican said nothing. No statement, no protest, nothing at all. By nightfall, the green grass below Debre Libanos ran dark. Elder monks, teenage novices, lay worshippers, one by one, lined up at the edge of the gorge, shot. Their bodies dropped into the ravine. Their names, never fully recorded. But there's more to this story. Among the dead were 3 scribes. They had been working on a special codex, a manuscript unlike any other, illuminated by hand, carefully guarded. It contained rare passages from the Book of Baruch, the Book of Tobit, and the Book of Enoch. But that wasn't all. Inside the codex was something else. A commentary, written by an unknown Ethiopian theologian. It spoke of the arrival of missionaries, and it carried a warning about how scripture had been shaped, altered, and claimed by Rome. The codex was never recovered. The Vatican made no formal search. But decades later, a letter surfaced, written by a Red Cross worker who visited the area after the massacre. She described seeing an Italian soldier walking away from the monastery. In his arms, a leather-bound bundle, stained with ash. When asked what it was, he simply said, "A book. One they died to protect." To this day, the Vatican archives contain no detailed record of the massacre. Even modern statements mention it only in passing, if at all. The words used are vague, unconfirmed, sensitive, complex. But in Ethiopia, it's not forgotten. Every year monks return to that place. They light candles, not just for the dead, but for what was taken, and for what may still survive. They believe the codex was hidden, passed on by one of the surviving novices, not to fuel revenge, not to spark rebellion, but to keep something sacred from vanishing, because some truths are buried in silence, others in blood. The train arrived in Rome just before dawn. Fog clung to the rails, curling around the station like it was trying to hide something. The city hadn't woken yet. There were no crowds, no ringing bells, just silence. One of the passengers stood alone. His coat was torn, his satchel frayed and heavy. His collar, once crisp with confidence, now slouched with the weight of long miles and longer silence. His name was Father Luca Benedetti. He had been gone nearly 5 years, sent by the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. His mission had been carefully worded, deliberate but vague. He was to build new alignment with the Ethiopian Church, to clarify doctrine, and above all, to retrieve certain texts rumored to still be in use among remote clergy. Whispers had reached Rome, tales of alternate gospels, prophecies, scrolls untouched by canon and untouched by time. The Vatican was uneasy. Luca was chosen not because he was bold, but because he followed orders that something happened in the highlands. And when he stepped off that train, no fanfare waited, no officials, no carriage from the Vatican, only a lone assistant from the archives, holding a letter with one line, "Report immediately, no delay." But he didn't. Instead, he walked straight to his quarters near the Lateran Palace, closed the curtains, lit a candle, and unpacked his satchel. There were no scrolls, no books, no report, only a folded cloth. Inside, a single page of vellum, the writing in Gaia's, and at the bottom, 3 interlocked crosses, enclosed in a circle. He placed it on the table and stared at it for hours. That night, he wrote a letter, not to Rome but to a friend from seminary, someone he hadn't seen in decades. In the letter, he confessed something extraordinary. "I went to convert them," he wrote, "but I was the one changed. I found a faith not buried in ritual, but alive in memory. They carry truths we've buried under stone and protocol. And I I know that if Rome saw what I saw, the walls would crack." The letter was never mailed. Years later, it was found in his desk drawer, unopened. There's no record of him ever reporting to the Vatican. No meeting, no statement. He faded quietly into a lesser post filed away in a small office outside the city. No one asked questions, but when his room was eventually cleared, the page of vellum was gone. No one saw it removed. No guards recalled anyone entering. The door had been locked. Sometimes, the greatest threat to power isn't a weapon. It's someone who saw the truth and came back alive. High in the northern mountains of Ethiopia, where the trees grow twisted by wind and the air thins with silence, there stands a monastery older than memory. It is called Abba Garima, named for the saint who is said to have founded it over 1,000 years ago. Some say he walked in from the east. Others say he came from the sky during a storm, holding a book that glowed in the rain. The Vatican has long known of this place. It appears in old missionary records, marked in red ink as a site of interest. But no official mission was ever sent. What makes it more than legend is a single manuscript, a codex. So old, scholars believe it may be the earliest Christian text still bound in its original cover. Its pages shimmer slightly in dim light, written in Gaia's, untouched by mold or decay. But it isn't the ink that unsettles those who see it. It's the final line, a prophecy, faded, almost erased but still legible, attributed to Abba Garima himself. It speaks of a time when truth would no longer belong to kings or councils, when sacred words would not be guarded by marble, but carried in silence, when the scrolls of the faithful would outlast the cathedrals of power. It warns of a distant church, one cloaked in gold, that would forget the face of Christ. When the Vatican first heard of this codex in 1958, a team was sent quietly, not bishops, not clergy, but 3 researchers, disguised as pilgrims. They were instructed to verify the manuscript, authenticate it, and if possible, bring it to Rome. The monks refused. One of the researchers, a young scholar named Lorenzo Bellini, kept a journal. In it, he described seeing the final page. The monks allowed him one glance. He wrote, "There were no jewels, no signature, no fanfare, just a line that said, 'The one who rewrites the word shall forget the word.'" That night, the team left without the manuscript. But Bellini never returned to Italy. 2 weeks later, a letter reached his family. He had chosen to stay in Ethiopia. He wanted to learn the old language, to walk the paths of the desert fathers, to live among those who still carried a memory. untouched by Rome. He was never heard from again. The Vatican has never acknowledged the prophecy. The name of Abba Garima is rarely mentioned in official texts. If it appears, it is in passing, buried in footnotes, surrounded by caution, but in the mountains, the codex still rests, wrapped in cloth, hidden in a stone room, watched by a monk who never sleeps indoors. They believe the prophecy is not a warning, it's a reminder that truth, once spoken, doesn't belong to those who fear it. It belongs to those who carry it, quietly, across time. After seeing the scroll, he ordered it sealed away, but not before leaning close to his aide and whispering something soft. If it cannot be spoken, perhaps it was never meant to be read. And yet, that's where the story starts to twist. In 1926, a Jesuit missionary named Father Auguste Lemaitre, stationed in the hills of Eritrea, claimed to witness a monk reading aloud from a scroll inscribed in that exact same script. He described the sound as melodic, eerie, and strangely resonant, even though the voice barely rose above a whisper. When he asked what language it was, the monk answered with calm certainty, "It is the tongue of those who walked before Babel." Father Lemaitre documented the encounter in a personal letter sent quietly to Rome. The letter was sealed, archived, and never officially released. But years later, a researcher deep within the Vatican's restricted stacks uncovered a single fragment of that letter. The last sentence read, "I understood nothing, and still I wept." The real shift didn't come through translation. It came through sleep. Several scholars who worked closely with the scroll began reporting strange dreams, intense, vivid visions of towering crystal cities, staircases floating in the sky, and choirs that sang without words. One professor left Rome entirely and took a vow of silence in a distant monastery. Another disappeared while traveling in Jerusalem and was never found. To this day, the Vatican denies possessing such a scroll. No mention of the language appears in its public catalogues. But among certain archivists, spoken only in passing, is a belief that the scroll was never intended to be read in the usual sense, because it doesn't speak to the brain, it speaks to memory. Not just your memory, or mine, or even a cultural one, something older, a language not tied to time, but to soul, a way of passing knowledge not through pages or ink, but through sensation, through presence. Before histories were written, before Babel scattered the tongue, in the quiet of winter, 1963, a small crate arrived at the Vatican from Addis Ababa. No diplomatic stamp, no crest, just a handwritten note, Archivum Secretum, handle with reverence. It was no larger than a suitcase, yet what lay inside would be whispered about for decades. Inside the crate was a single book, dense, heavy, bound in something no one could name. It wasn't quite leather. It felt soft, pliable, but unlike any animal hide ever studied. The archivist who first unwrapped it later described the sensation like touching skin that remembered being alive. There was no title, no emblem, not a single mark to tell its origin, only a faded shape on the front cover, the faint imprint of a human hand pressed into the material as though someone long ago had touched it and never returned. The Vatican gave it a placeholder, CEX Obscura, Item 4, but among the inner circle of scholars who examined it privately, it earned another name, the Flesh Gospel. Some claimed its pages were ordinary parchment, aged and inked like any other. But the cover that was something else. A biologist from the University of Milan was brought in discreetly. She analyzed a small fiber fragment. Her report, quietly filed, noted that the DNA appeared to be human and not from one person, but several. That report never saw public light. Her lab was destroyed in a fire a month later. No one was injured. But the samples and her original notes were lost. Still, the mystery didn't end with the skin. Inside the codex were passages written in no known order. Some lines mirrored stories from the Book of Enoch. Others described scenes more apocalyptic than anything found in accepted scripture. There were prayers in Ge'ez, but not like any preserved in Ethiopia or Rome. One section described a gate hidden in the desert, a place where angels did not serve, but waited. Another told of figures descending from high places, not fallen. Sent to teach, sent to warn. But the passage that disturbed the scholars most described no story at all. It outlined a ritual, a method of reading, not with eyes, but with touch. The instructions were simple, almost too simple. Place your hand on the cover. Listen, not with ears, but with what it called the bone behind the breath. No one admitted to trying it. But days later, a priest named Father Roberto Cella was found in his chamber, candles burning at all corners of the room, papers scattered across the floor. He had written a single line over and over again. It is not dead. It is only waiting. The Vatican immediately removed the codex from circulation. It was placed in a temperature-controlled vault beneath the Apostolic Palace. The crate it arrived in was destroyed. The archivist who received it was transferred to a remote mission in South America. Officially, it does not exist. Yet, some believe the book was not wrapped in human skin to honor the dead, but to contain something that should never be free. And if one day it is opened again, not by hands, but by belief. The question is not what it will say, but to whom. In 1939, while the world above braced for war, something quiet happened beneath the marble floors of the Vatican Library. A monk named Brother Anselmo, tasked with restoring fragile manuscripts, was given a bundle of old parchment that had been pulled from an unmarked crate. No date, no author, no known origin. The pages were dry and delicate, yet oddly untouched by time. But what caught Brother Anselmo's eye first wasn't the script, though it was written in ancient Trias. It was the ink. It shimmered. Even after 1,000 years, it looked like it had just been brushed onto stone. When light touched the letters, they glistened. Not like metal, not like paint, like something alive. And no matter how often the parchment was handled, no matter how long it sat exposed to air or sun, the ink never faded. Brother Anselmo had spent his life preserving the written word. He had seen texts turn to dust, edges crumble beneath breath. But this was different. He called it the ink that breathes. The Vatican's conservators brought it under magnification, hoping for answers. There were none. No traces of iron, no gall, no When tested under flame, the ink glowed, a soft, radiant hue beneath candlelight. But in sunlight it dulled, as if hiding from the day, and if left alone, in complete darkness, the pages would begin to emit a faint blue pulse, as if they remembered being read. One passage in particular drew immediate attention. It was centered on the page, larger than the rest. Just 5 words, but bolder, darker. A warning, or perhaps a key. Roughly translated, it said, "The truth preserves itself in fire." The moment that phrase was documented, the manuscript was pulled from open study, but not before a young Ethiopian scholar named Tesgen Yohannes made a quick sketch of the page. He had been invited by a sympathetic Jesuit, meant only to assist with translation, but after copying that line, he was dismissed from the project. No explanation, no warning. Days later, his small guest room along the Tiber was found empty. No signs of struggle. Only a torn page from his notebook, left tucked beneath his pillow. 2 years passed. Then, during an unrelated study of medieval texts from Ethiopia's northern hills, a Vatican researcher discovered something almost impossible. An identical phrase. Same words, same ink, same shimmer. But the manuscript had never left Ethiopia. The two were oceans apart. Centuries apart, yet bore the same hand. Or so it seemed. The ink, it appeared, was more than material. It was memory. To this day, the Vatican refuses to comment. But it said the manuscript now rests sealed inside a lead-lined case, far from light. Not because it's fragile, but because of what it resists. Silence. Obscurity. Erasure. Brother Anselmo died in 1952. His final words, whispered to the night librarian, were simple. It's not that the ink won't fade, it's that the true cannot. They say the Ark of the Covenant was swallowed by time lost in war, hidden by fire, or carried off by those who never returned. But far from the cathedrals and reliquaries of Rome, beneath the shadow of whispering fig trees in northern Ethiopia, there stands a chapel, small, unadorned, guarded by only one man. He never leaves the grounds. He speaks to no one. He shares no meals. His life is bound to a single purpose: to protect what his people believe is the holiest object on earth. The Ark. Not a replica. Not a symbol. The Ark. According to Ethiopian tradition, it was brought to Aksum nearly 3,000 years ago by Menelik, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. It wasn't taken. It was given, carried with divine blessing across deserts and mountains. It found its resting place in the highlands of Ethiopia. Ever since, it's been watched over by generations of monks. Each generation, one is chosen, a guardian for life. The Vatican has never officially recognized the claim, but that hasn't stopped its interest. In the early 20th century, several quiet envoys were sent from Rome to Ethiopia. Their missions were not announced. Their findings never published. One of them, Father Bartolo Gosti, recorded his journey in a letter, now sealed inside the Archivum Secretum. He described the chapel's outer walls, the rituals performed outside its threshold, and the strange stillness that surrounded the site. He never saw the ark, but he wrote that while standing near its gate, he felt something deep, old, heavy, as if the ground itself remembered. Because the fear in Rome wasn't only that the ark might be real, it was it never belonged to them. For centuries, the Vatican shaped its authority around relics, bones of saints, shards of the cross, thorns from the crown, each one locked in golden cases, wrapped in incense and guarded behind glass. They were sacred, but they were also symbols of power. But the ark was something else. It wasn't just sacred, it was active. It had parted seas, flattened walls, judged kings. And if it truly rested not in Rome but in Africa, then the center of divine authority shifted with it. In 1937, during the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, Italian troops approached the chapel in Axum. They were under orders, but they never went inside. Years later, an Ethiopian priest wrote that the soldiers reached the gate, looked up, and turned back. One claimed he heard thunder, though the sky was clear. After that day, Rome's inquiries ended. No more letters, no more visit. But the guardian remains. He does not speak. He does not leave. And no one, not scholar, not priest, not king, has crossed that threshold since. In the late 1930s, as war tightened its grip on Europe and empires made quiet deals beneath flags, the Vatican made a request. It was not written, not stamped. It didn't pass through diplomatic hands. It moved in whispers from Rome to Addis Ababa, carried not by priests but by men in uniform. The mission was simple in wording, impossible in spirit. Bring the ark to Rome. The plan had taken shape years earlier, during Mussolini's campaign in Ethiopia. As Italian forces moved through towns and temples, certain figures within the Vatican saw an opportunity. If the ark was real, not legend but object, then it belonged, they believed, not in Axum, but at the heart of Christendom. Not for study, they said, for protection. But in private, a different word surfaced, possession. One document, never published, quietly labeled Operation Exodus, outlined a plan to remove the ark under the guise of ceremony. The Ethiopian church would be told it was temporary, a gesture of unity, a sacred act between brothers in faith. But the monks in Axum knew history. They remembered the last time something was taken in the name of unity. In 1937, Italian soldiers neared the chapel. The guardian stood alone at the gate. He held no weapon, only a small wooden cross. He said nothing. He did not move. The soldiers hesitated. They radioed for orders. They were told to wait, but then night fell, and something shifted. One soldier, years later, in a letter he never sent, wrote that as the sky darkened, the chapel began to glow, not with flame, not with light, but with something softer, a pale shimmer that moved like breath. Birds stopped singing, the air thickened, and from within the walls came a silence so deep it hurt. The soldiers turned back. The gate remained untouched. Rome never acknowledged the mission. The name Operation Exodus was erased from all records. But in 1962, during the Second Vatican Council, an Ethiopian bishop was granted an unusually long private audience with the Pope. No transcript exists. No summary remains. But afterward, the Pope cancelled a planned visit to Jerusalem. Instead, he asked to walk the halls of the archives, alone. The ark never came to Rome. It remains in Axum, unseen, untouched, unclaimed. But the attempt left a mark, a fracture beneath the surface, a silence between two churches. Some believe that moment changed the Vatican's approach to power, that it served as a reminder. Not everything holy can be held. Not every mystery belongs behind glass. And the most sacred things are often the ones that refuse to be taken. There is a room beneath the Vatican Library where light barely reaches. Time feels slower there. The walls are lined with aging boxes, some tied shut with string, others left blank. In one corner, behind a steel gate with no official key, sits a book few even know exists. It's not in the catalogue, not in the restricted index, not even in the sealed ledgers used for unnamed relics. They call it the Red Book, though the cover is not red. Not really. It's almost black like dried blood in shadow. The spine is worn, the edges curled. The lettering is handwritten in jeers, a script most Vatican scholars can't even recognize. There's no author, no title, only a symbol burned into the front. A winged creature with 3 faces, each looking in a different direction. The book first arrived in 1929, part of a shipment salvaged from a monastery during civil conflict in Ethiopia. Most of the texts went straight to translation. This one was different. A young Jesuit opened it. He didn't make it past the 2nd page before collapsing. He never explained what he saw. He left the priesthood a month later. The book was immediately sealed in a private vault marked pending translation. It hasn't been touched since, at least not officially, but stories began to drift through the walls. Quiet, persistent. An archivist claimed he saw a page turn on its own. Another said the ink faded when he looked directly at it, then returned when he turned away. One man, after working near the vault for a year, resigned without notice and returned to his childhood village in the Alps. He never entered a library again. In the 1950s, a researcher tried to catalogue the book. He gave it a placeholder number and began filling out the registry form. But every time he wrote its name, the ink disappeared. He switched pens. Nothing. Pencil, chalk, even carving. The page remained blank. Eventually, he filed the form empty, signed, sealed. Later, the seal was found cracked, but no one confessed to opening it. The room had been locked. In recent decades, a rumor has grown, one that whispers through late-night guard shifts and forgotten corners of the archive. They say the book contains a different version of the Book of Enoch, one that merges ancient prophecies with names, popes, kings, saints, not just with their births or deaths, but something stranger, return. Ask any Vatican official, and they'll say it doesn't exist. The guards still report hearing something faint at night. Not footsteps, not whispers, pages, turning, in the dark, even when no one is there. It was tucked inside a velvet pouch, hidden in the back of a desk drawer that hadn't been opened since 1968, the year Brother Matteo Ferrani died in his sleep. He had served in the Archivum Secretum for over 3 decades, quiet, precise, known for organizing fragile manuscripts with an almost obsessive care. He rarely spoke during meals, rarely left the lower floors. Then one morning he simply didn't come to work. They said his heart had stopped. Peacefully. When his replacement cleaned the desk, he found the key, small, cold, made from a metal no one could quite name. It didn't match any cabinet or vault in the archive. The teeth were too fine, too many, too deliberate. No tag, no label, no record. It opened nothing. Still, the Vatican kept it. A file was created, as all strange objects receive one, but the file never grew. No architect recognized the design. No locksmith could replicate it. Eventually it was placed in a sealed envelope, marked unassigned, and stored in a drawer with other curiosities, odd bookmarks, half-faded coins, forgotten rings. It became a kind of quiet joke among the scribes, a key to nowhere, the key to the kingdom, the key to a door the church forgot. Then, in the spring of 1983, something changed. An Ethiopian scholar, visiting to study Gay's manuscripts, was being given a tour. When shown the key, he didn't smile. He turned pale. He asked to sit down, and after a long silence, he said something that made the room fall still. He had seen a door like it before, not in Rome, in a monastery, hidden near the border of Eritrea. As a child, he'd visited the grounds with his uncle, a priest, and inside the stone walls, carved into the side of a hill, was a sealed gate, no handle, no hinges. Only a slot, narrow and exact, shaped like an ancient sun cross. The same shape etched faintly into the top of the Vatican key. When he tried to explain further, the tour was cut short. That night, his hotel room was found empty. His luggage was untouched. His passport still on the nightstand. No report was filed. No search made public. He was never seen again. Since then, the key has been moved twice, once to a private drawer in the papal apartments, and once more, quietly to a wall safe behind an old portrait, locked with a code known to only one man. Some still call it a curiosity. Others believe it opened something not built by human hands. And a few whisper that beneath the Vatican, lower than any map shows, there is a chamber. No record, no air, no light, just a door, with no name, still waiting. It was the winter of 1937. Pope Pius XI sat alone in his private study, surrounded by unread letters and maps of Africa. Outside, Rome bristled with unrest. Italy's armies were deep in Ethiopia, and the Vatican had begun receiving quiet reports, whispers of relics, ancient books, churches untouched by any Western hand. Among the documents placed on the Pope's desk that evening was one marked simply, "Urgent. Eyes only." It had come from a Jesuit contact stationed near Lake Tana. Inside were sketches, travel notes, and a translated excerpt from a scroll found high in the Ethiopian mountains. The scroll, written in J's, carried a prophecy, one that disturbed the Pope more than anything he had read before. It spoke of a lost gospel, a black lion, and a city made of stone hidden beneath the earth. But one line had been underlined in red. "When Rome touches what it does not understand, the fire will rise." Pope Pius read the line 3 times. Then, he gave a single order: lock the door. He was a scholar. Careful. A man who believed deeply in truth, but feared what truth could undo. The Vatican had long collected secrets, some too strange to speak aloud. But this was different, because this wasn't myth. It wasn't rumor. The scroll had been authenticated. Its ink matched pre-Christian formulas. The parchment showed age consistent with texts over 2,000 years old, and the translation, verified by 3 separate scholars, was clear. It didn't speak of a Messiah born of David's line. It described a child born of Solomon and Sheba. It didn't place the ark in Jerusalem. It placed it in Axum, and it didn't tell of a church built on Peter's bones. It told of a covenant forged in the African highlands. That same night, the Pope spoke to his secretary in private. No letter, no record, just spoken words. Close the Ethiopian file. Move the scroll to the vault. Restrict all research related to Ethiopian relics, prophecies, or scriptures, unless directly approved by the Holy Office. The next morning, an internal notice was circulated. A new classification was born: Indexed Sanctus Obscura, the index of hidden holy things. Years later, after the Pope's quiet death in 1939, his personal effects were examined, but the Ethiopian file was missing. Only a single note remained, tucked inside his Bible, just beneath the Book of Acts, written by hand, underlined twice. What we silence today may return in fire tomorrow, but let the Church be spared that reckoning. No Pope has ever reversed his order, and the scroll remains sealed. She was known only as a Baba, a name meaning flower in the old Ethiopian tongue, a healer, a mystic, a woman said to speak with angels. She lived in the green hills near Lake Tana during the late 1700s. The local priests called her blessed. Villagers came from days away just to touch her feet. Some said she had raised the dead. For a time, even the Vatican considered her for sainthood. Her story first reached Rome in 1821, through a Jesuit letter carried by hand across deserts and sea. The letter spoke of a Baba's visions, her healing touch, and her ability to recite long passages of scripture. But there was something else. She quoted verses no one recognized, words not found in any Bible approved by Rome. She spoke only in J's, and yet, when transcribed, her speech matched fragments from Christian texts lost since the 2nd century. That detail caught the Church's attention. So, they sent someone, a Vatican envoy named Father Lorenzo Dionte, accompanied by a linguist and a scribe, arrived in Ethiopia under the cover of pilgrimage. What he found was not a fraud, not a heretic, but a quiet woman living in a stone cell surrounded by candles, scrolls, and silence. She wore no title, held no crown, yet people still knelt when they approached her. Father Lorenzo documented everything in a leather-bound journal, now hidden deep within the Vatican's archive. He described her as having a presence unlike any he had seen, holy, but not performative. He wrote of a healing. A child, breathless and pale, brought before her. Baba laid her hands gently on the child's chest, whispered something. Moments later, the child opened his eyes and said, "The fire has passed." But what troubled the Vatican wasn't her miracles, it was her knowledge. She spoke freely of the early church, of apostles whose names had been stripped from history. She claimed the first altar after Christ's death was not built in Rome, but in Axum. And she spoke of a black book buried beneath a ruined monastery, sealed in gold and guarded by silence. In 1824, the church formally began her canonization process, but it was never completed. Testimonies vanished. Reports were pulled. Father Lorenzo returned to Rome ill, his final report undelivered. He died before it could be written. Decades later, a single page was found, sewn into the lining of his travel satchel. It read, "She was too close to the truth. Not for our time. Not yet." Her name was removed from the sainthood record. But in Ethiopia, she is still remembered. Her tomb is visited, her cell left untouched. And once a year, on the day of her death, the chapel bell rings, though no one pulls the rope. The Vatican no longer speaks her name, but the hills still whisper it. In the quiet corners of a stone chapel high in the Ethiopian highlands, a prayer is whispered, not to a distant god, but to one who walked with bare feet, who breathed warm air. To the Ethiopian church, Christ is not just divine, he is living flesh. Not a metaphor, not a symbol, but presence. This belief, though ancient, shook the walls of Rome long before councils and doctrines drew their lines. Because in Ethiopia, they held to their own understanding, that God didn't simply appear as a man, he became one. Entirely. Not two natures bound together, not a divine self and a human shell, but something whole. Blood, bone, and spirit, braided into one form. This belief wasn't passed through decree. It was sung, told in story, shared in incense rising between stone walls and sunlit carvings. But to the Vatican, it posed a problem. In the year 41, during the Council of Chalcedon, the Church declared the doctrine Christ is both fully God and fully man, two natures without confusion. But Ethiopia was not there. They kept their own witness, their own words, that Christ's divinity and humanity were not separate, not two, not even one split, but something deeper, something that couldn't be divided. Rome called it heresy. The term they used was monophysite, but those who listened closely knew better. What Ethiopia held wasn't rebellion, it was mystery. In 1927, a Vatican scholar named Father Emilianus traveled to the monastery of Debre Damo. He returned changed. He brought with him a carved icon of Christ. Not Roman, not European. The face was gentle, but dark. The robes, unlike anything seen in the West. The eyes wide, knowing. In his journal, Emilianus wrote, "He looked not like a king of marble, but a man of the land. And still, I could not look away." What disturbed the church wasn't the art. It was the power behind it. These weren't mere paintings. They were theology carved in wood. Not born in councils, but in contact. A Vatican official, reviewing the scholar's notes, wrote a private remark in the margin. "Their Christ is not ours. He does not answer to Rome." That sentence was never meant to leave the archive, but a copy survived, tucked into the back of a forgotten report, yellowed with time. And the question still lingers, soft but sharp. What if the real mystery of Christ was never in understanding him, but in not trying to explain him at all? Behind the high stone walls of the Ethiopian College in Rome, there is a chapel few ever notice. No tourists visit, no guidebooks mention it. Even many priests walk past without knowing what once hung inside. A painting. Not large, not golden, not designed to dazzle, but unforgettable to those who saw it. It showed Christ seated on a carved wooden throne. His feet rested gently on a clouded cushion. Around him, golden light flickered through delicate brush strokes. But it wasn't the throne, or the clouds, or the light. It was his face. Christ was painted as a black man, his skin deep brown, his eyes wide and calm, his hair tightly curled, his presence still, watching, waiting. There was no softness to comfort, and no anger to provoke, just presence, The artist had captured something ancient, something human, something royal. According to old records, the painting arrived in the early 1600s, carried by an Ethiopian priest named Father Tekle Hymanot. He brought it in a wooden box, wrapped in linen and prayer. It was accepted with reverence, placed carefully inside the small chapel, and then years passed. Decades. A shift in leadership, a quiet change. No announcement, no debate. The painting was taken down. No explanation, no new artwork replaced it. Just an empty wall. But those who remembered it still speak in whispers, not just about the image, but about what it represented. A Christ who didn't match the paintings in Roman cathedrals. A Christ who belonged not just to the West, but to the world. And maybe more than that. A Christ who didn't need Rome's approval to be holy. Some believe the painting was moved quietly into storage. Others think it was sent back to Ethiopia. But a few archivists say they've seen it. Not hanging. Not framed. But wrapped again. Stored in a crate with no label. Hidden among relics never displayed. Because perhaps, like the stories, the scrolls, and the voices that came before, it wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about ownership. It was about presence, and presence can't be explained. It can only be felt. So the painting remains, forgotten by most, but not by all. Its silence speaks, its absence echoes, and deep in the corners of faith, where history bends into story, and story bends into sleep, one image still lingers. A throne not gilded in gold, but carved by hand. A face not shaped by doctrine, but by dust and breath. And a Christ who waits, not to be seen, but to be remembered. The Vatican never released an official statement. No decrees, no public denials, but in hushed tones behind stone doors, unease rippled. Some murmured that the image pushed too far, that it asked questions the church wasn't prepared to face. Because if for generations entire nations had worshipped a Christ with dark skin, what did that mean for the narrative Western Europe had long protected? What did it suggest about the saints carved in pale marble, the paintings in Vatican halls, the icons that had shaped kingdoms and blessed crowns? In 1942, during the chaos of war, the painting disappeared. The Vatican librarian noted privately in his journal that it had been stored beneath the Arcum Secretum, not burned, not discarded, simply hidden. But not all things stay buried. In the early 2000s, a photo emerged, just one. A scholar said it had been taken in the 70s by an Ethiopian monk visiting Rome. The Vatican never confirmed its truth, but those who had stood before the original nodded. The same features, the same eyes, and so the question lingers. Was the image of a black Christ too radical, or too real? Maybe the threat wasn't the art itself, but the quiet that followed, the silence that pressed deeper than denial, the history it unveiled without uttering a word. In a city built on centuries of sacred stories, the most unsettling truths are often the ones hidden not in shadow, but behind daylight and a locked door. The flame was small, but the paper caught quickly. It happened late one evening, deep in the garden behind the Apostolic Palace. A servant held the torch but was told to avert his eyes. A cardinal stood watching, silent, and the one who gave the order stood with his hands clasped tightly, his face pale beneath the moon. He was the Pope. Not every secret in the Vatican is hidden beneath layers of stone. Some are reduced to ash. The document in question was short, fewer than 50 pages bound in rough leather, penned in an elegant, deliberate script. But what it claimed, what it dared to suggest, made it dangerous. It spoke of visions, of revelations, of a theology that diverged from Rome's holy declarations. It described a Christ, not only seen in human form, but walking among the poor in the Ethiopian highlands, speaking the ancient language of gaze, and calling saints by names the West had never known. The Pope who ordered its destruction was not known for anger. He was soft-spoken, reflective, distant, but something within those pages disturbed him. Some say it was a passage claiming the church had chosen the wrong road 1,000 years ago. Others believe it named an Ethiopian monk, whose teachings mirrored the earliest apostles more closely than anything Rome preserved. Whatever it was, it crossed a line, not only of doctrine, but of power, of control rooted deep in time. The fire devoured the book in minutes, but not entirely. Unknown to the Pope, one Vatican archivist had copied it by hand, every page, not out of defiance, but reverence. He believed the words were sacred, that they should endure. He hid the copy in a scroll case, sealed behind a false wall in a forgotten chapel just outside the city. That chapel no longer opens its doors. It was closed in the 50s after lightning fractured the roof, but the panel, they say, still remains. What unsettled the Pope wasn't the flames. It wasn't even being found out. It was what the book suggested could exist: a different narrative, a different Christ, a faith not centered in Rome, but rising from the mountains, where stone churches held voices that didn't echo the Vatican. In the Holy City, silence speaks louder than bell, and when something is burned, it is not always lost. Sometimes the fire is only the beginning. It was modest in size, no larger than a dinner plate, framed in dark wood, wrapped gently in linen. It arrived without ceremony, like most relics do. No headlines, no crowd, just a single monk from the Ethiopian highlands, barefoot, walking the final stretch in silence, holding the painting as though it breathed. He spoke only a few words of Latin, enough to say, "This now belongs to us both." The painting showed the Madonna and Child, but not in the familiar European image. Their skin was dark, their features soft and almond-eyed. The robes shimmered with deep reds, gold and indigo. The Christ Child didn't hold a cross, but a scroll. Behind them, a faint landscape. No Bethlehem in sight, only hills that looked unmistakably like the Ethiopian north. It was placed without notice in a quiet chapel near the back of the basilica. No plaques, no explanation. Just a painting surrounded by candles, waiting to be found by wandering pilgrims and quiet priests. At first it drew little attention, but within weeks the whispers started. A custodian spoke first, said the eyes moved, not abruptly, not like a trick of light, but slowly, following those who stood too close. Then a priest noticed clear drops on the floor beneath the frame, sticky, faintly sweet, like tears. He wiped them away, but the next morning, they returned. Scholars were brought in. They examined the canvas, the pigments, the wooden frame. No trickery, no hidden device. The linen behind was untouched. Yet still, the droplets came. One quiet afternoon, during a small mass, a nun seated in the second pew gasped aloud. She said the Madonna wept, not imagined, not dreamed. She saw it. 2 slow tears that fell down the figure's cheeks and vanished before they reached the frame. That night the painting was removed. Not returned, not destroyed, hidden. No statement followed, no entry in the official record, but a guard assigned to the papal residence later spoke of a conversation overheard behind a closed door. The Pope wasn't furious, he was afraid. If this becomes known, he said, we lose the center. The painting, they learned, came from a monastery built in the 5th century. It had hung above an altar where pilgrims prayed in gaze, a language the Vatican never fully claimed, and the scroll in the child's hands. It wasn't from Matthew or Luke. The monk said it was the Book of Enoch, a scripture long locked away by Rome. The Vatican keeps many things hidden, but that quiet image, unassuming as it was, left behind an echo. Some believe it still weeps, behind stone, behind silence, in the narrow space where faith meets fear. In the spring of 1935, dark clouds gathered over Africa, and Rome, though watching closely, said nothing. At the heart of that silence stood 2 powerful figures, one dressed in white robes, offering blessings from balconies, the other in black, shouting from podiums, promising to revive an empire. Pope Pius XI and Benito Mussolini never shared a platform, but they shared something deeper: proximity and silence. When Mussolini prepared to invade Ethiopia, the Vatican did not raise its voice. No statements of protest, no sermons calling for peace. Instead, the meetings began, quiet conversations behind the closed doors of the Apostolic Palace, envoys moving between corridors, agreements never written, but clearly understood. In October of that year, the invasion began. Planes dropped poison, churches were shelled, monasteries burned, and St. Peter's Square remained still, not because the Vatican celebrated violence, but because Ethiopia's Christianity was viewed as something else, a rival tradition, ancient, independent, too close to the truth Rome claimed as its own. Their scriptures held stories long rejected by Europe. Their faith stretched back through time without papal permission. One note, scribbled in the margin of a diplomatic file, said it best: just 7 words, handwritten beside a typed report from a Vatican advisor. If the libraries burn, we never answer. That one sentence spoke volumes. For centuries, Rome shaped history through sacred texts, But Ethiopia's texts told a parallel tale. The Queen of Sheba, her son Menelik, the Ark of the Covenant. The Ethiopian Bible held books Rome had cast aside, and through it all, their priests spoke in Gaze, a tongue older than Latin, untouched by European councils. Mussolini wanted land, the Vatican wanted the narrative, and in that moment, their interests aligned, but not everyone stayed quiet. A young bishop in Florence began writing letters. In them he questioned the silence, quoted Isaiah, warned of consequences. His last letter, dated March 1937, was returned unopened. Shortly after, he was reassigned to a remote parish and never published again. Decades later, deep in the Vatican library, a sealed envelope was found. Inside, a photograph, Ethiopian monks standing in the rubble of a church, holding scraps of manuscript. Across the top, in faded ink, they tried to erase us. The Vatican never denied its silence, but it never explained it either. That silence still lingers. Behind the gardens of St. Peter's, a small plaque sits weathered and nearly hidden. It bears no name, only a date, October 3rd, 1935, and a single line of scripture: "Woe unto them that call evil good, not meant for the world, perhaps meant for the church itself." In the quiet shadows of the Vatican's archival wing, far from the echo of tourists and prayer, there's a drawer with no label, no catalogue entry, no key held by anyone living. But according to whispered accounts passed between retired clerks, this drawer holds the Haile Selassie files. Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia wasn't just a political figure. To his people, he was sacred. A monarch descended, it was said, directly from Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And to the Vatican, that made him something far more dangerous. He was a ruler who upheld a Christian legacy older than Rome's own. After Mussolini's invasion ended in 1936, Selassie was exiled, but from abroad, his voice only grew stronger. At the League of Nations in Geneva, he stood alone and delivered a speech that would ripple through the halls of the Vatican like distant thunder. He spoke not just of nations, but of prophecy, not just of justice, but of judgment. And the God he called upon was not of Latin rites, but the ancient God of Ethiopia. One Vatican observer, Father Leone Marini, recorded the event in precise, careful notes. His report, marked confidential and sent directly to the Secretariat of State, included one unexpected line: "This man does not beg," he wrote. "He speaks as though he already knows how the story ends." When Mussolini fell and Selassie returned to power, Rome grew uneasy. Diplomats were dispatched under Vatican cover. Some were instructed to offer reconciliation. Others were told simply to watch and listen. What they found surprised them. Monks preserving prophecies that had never been translated into Latin, writings that challenged Rome's official timeline. One letter, lost for decades, described a prophecy foretelling a time when the Empire of the West would wear the robes of the East and forget its origin. That letter was sealed, never But in 1949, Selassie sent a gift to the Pope, a codex written in Gas, said to contain visions seen by the emperor himself. It was never displayed, never mentioned, but a memo from that year referenced a book of signs received from Ethiopia, locked in the Archum Secretum due to its contents and unclear origin. The file stayed closed. In 1975, after Selassie's death under house arrest, a note was added in red pencil, the kind used only by senior archivists. It read, "Do not destroy, do not discuss, await the end of the century." No one knows who wrote that line, and more hauntingly, no one has ever dared to erase it. In the spring of 1936, within the hushed corridors of the Vatican, a strange quiet settled over the marble floors of St. Peter's. It wasn't the stillness of prayer. It was the kind of silence that comes after something has shifted. Quiet, heavy, waiting to be named. That shift hadn't come from within Rome. It came from Geneva. There, dressed in regal robes stitched in the Ethiopian tradition, a man stood alone before the League of Nations. Haile Selassie, exiled emperor, displaced by Mussolini's war, spoke not as a politician pleading for aid, but as a prophet delivering a reckoning. His words weren't aimed solely at world leaders. According to a Vatican diplomat in attendance, they were directed quietly, unmistakably toward Rome itself, toward the Vatican, toward the Holy See. Selassie's voice never rose. He didn't shout, he didn't plead. He spoke of justice, of faith, of an ancient covenant between his people and their God. He reminded the room that Ethiopia embraced Christianity before Rome ever claimed the cross. that the faith his people carried was older than their exile, older than the Latin tongue. The Vatican had sent Bishop Armand Del Vecchio to observe. Known for translating Syriac texts, not for diplomacy, Del Vecchio kept to himself, but in his private report, he wrote just one line that mattered. It was not a speech, it was scripture, and he meant it. He wrote that it felt as though the words didn't come from the emperor at all, but through him. That night, even though Selassie had never set foot inside the basilica, his words seemed to echo through its stone halls. Monsignors spoke in hushed tones. Cardinals debated behind heavy doors. The Pope's advisors feared that Ethiopia's claims might force a re-evaluation of everything, its relics, its language, its lineage. What disturbed them most wasn't what had been said publicly, it was the final phrase, omitted from the official transcript. A whisper, spoken just before Selassie left the podium. According to Del Vecchio, the emperor said, "The Lion of Judah still watches from the mountains, and his roar is not forgotten." That sentence, a symbol both royal and biblical, sparked unease. One Vatican historian scribbled in the margin of the report, "If true, we must reconsider what we call apostolic." The Pope made no public statement, but 3 days later, the Ethiopian section of the Vatican Library was quietly restricted. Bishop Del Vecchio was reassigned to a remote post in northern Spain. He never published again. The world forgot the speech, but the Vatican did not. Even now, its echo moves softly through the basilica, not carried by air, but by memory, and the fear of a truth no one in Rome can claim. Late one summer night in 1936, the stone passageways beneath Vatican City fell quiet. The lamps burned low, casting soft pools of gold across the old cobbled floor beneath St. Peter's Square. That hallway had seen many secrets pass through it. Bishops carrying forbidden texts, archivists with locked crates, cardinals whispering thoughts they could never speak aloud. But on that night, silence was broken by boots. Heavy, purposeful. The Swiss Guard was on patrol. It was just days after Emperor Haile Selassie's speech in Geneva. His words, though delivered far from Rome, had drifted back, like smoke, through a cracked door. Some said his voice had stirred something in the archives, something ancient, something long buried. A young guard, Matthias Ulrich, just 22, had been assigned to the eastern entrance of the archive vaults. He was new, eager, and that night, according to a buried report in the guard's own log, he saw someone, a man in black robes, walking slowly toward the restricted corridor. He said nothing, carried no credentials, but in his hand was a small, cloth-wrapped book, its edges glinting with gold. Ulrich raised his hand, asked the man to stop, but the figure didn't slow. Ulrich stepped forward, gripping his halberd, and then he was gone, not vanished around a corner, not slipped through a hidden door, gone as though the shadows themselves had taken him. Ulrich raised the alarm. Within minutes, 4 more guards arrived. Every hallway searched, every door checked. No one found nothing, except one item left behind, lying on the floor where the figure had last stood. A ring, brass, etched with a single word in GEs. No one could read it. The event was never recorded in official history, but what happened next wasn't coincidence. Ulrich was quietly transferred to a rural basilica near Milan. No ceremony, no explanation. At the same time, a set of unmarked crates arrived from the Ethiopian College. No inventory, no signature, moved into a wing of the archive that doesn't appear on any map. Years later, an elder archivist would whisper over wine that the Vatican never feared an army. It feared a revelation. That night wasn't about a ghost. It wasn't even about a guard seeing something strange. It was about a door they thought had been locked for good, creaking open once again. The Swiss Guard never spoke of it. The ring was never filed, and for 3 days after that night, the archive doors remained sealed. 12 armed men posted at the entrance, while the bells of St. Peter's remained silent. In a quiet room deep inside the Vatican museums, behind thick glass and soft, colorless light, rests an object no visitor was ever meant to see. It's a gold cross. Small, strange, tucked away in the back of a private collection only a few curators know by name. Official records claim it arrived during the chaos of the Second World War, donated by a European collector. But the real story is older and far more troubling. The cross doesn't match Roman design, or Byzantine, or anything seen in Western tradition. Its arms curve outward like vines, ending in shapes that resemble fire or feathers. On one side, a ring of Amharic script. On the other, an engraving, a lion with wings. But the most haunting part lies at the center, a gemstone, blood red, polished like glass, shaped like an eye. The gem is not native to Europe, nor the Holy Land. Experts traced it to the Ethiopian highlands near Axum, a place tied to the oldest Christian traditions in Africa. The Vatican had seen this symbol before. It matched a drawing found in the margins of the Book of Enoch, only preserved in Ethiopia. They believed the eye represented divine judgment, the all-seeing presence of the Watchers. The same Watchers the Church had declared heresy for centuries, buried, forgotten. And yet here it was, cut into gold, carried through time. But the real mystery began with a scholar. In 1973, a young Jesuit named Father Leono was granted rare access to the collection. He studied the cross for hours, sketched it, translated what he could. His journal was never published, but years later portions were leaked by a former student. In those notes, he wrote that the inscription included a date long before the time of Christ, and a single phrase, translated simply, "The covenant was taken south, not lost." That one line sent alarm bells through the archives. If true, it meant the cross was more than a relic. It was a marker, a trail, not just tied to Ethiopia, but to the Ark itself. Within days, Father Leono's research was halted. The cross locked away again. Leono was reassigned to Argentina. He never spoke of the cross again. The Vatican labeled the translation inconclusive, but those who've seen the artifact say that sometimes in just the right light, the gem seems to glow faintly as though something inside it still watched. Inside the grand halls of the Vatican, there are truths never spoken aloud, not printed, not preached, not whispered in seminaries. One of them is a schism, not the great divide between East and West, not the Reformation, but another break, quiet, invisible, and never officially declared. A fracture between the Roman Church and the ancient Church of Ethiopia. It didn't begin with flames or rebellion. No war, no protests. It unfolded slowly in letters never answered, in visits never announced, in decisions made behind closed doors. And yet it changed everything. Long before Rome claimed authority over Christian doctrine, Ethiopia had already built its own faith, deeply rooted in Jewish customs, filled with Hebrew rhythms, guarded by scriptures the Vatican would later call apocryphal. Their prayers rose from mountains and deserts far from Roman eyes, and for centuries the Vatican watched, uneasy. In the early 1600s, the Jesuits were sent, not only as missionaries, but as enforcers. Their goal: bring Ethiopia into alignment with Rome. They arrived with gifts, flattered kings, held quiet debates in candlelit monasteries, but Ethiopia stood firm. Their priests refused to abandon the Book of Enoch. They wouldn't deny the full humanity of Mary. They would not trade their chants for Latin hymns. When persuasion failed, silence followed. A letter written by a cardinal in 1639, found centuries later in a private archive, spoke of grief. The Holy See, it said, mourned the loss of the Highland brethren. But the letter was never published. No statement was made. Rome simply stopped mentioning Ethiopia, as if forgetting could heal what pride had broken. But Ethiopia remembered. In a monastery near Lake Tana, a wooden door still bears an old carving, a lion turning its back on a two-headed eagle. The monks say it was carved after the last Jesuit left. The lion, they say, is Judah, the eagle is Rome. The carving isn't angry, it's mournful. A quiet farewell. And yet, deep in the Vatican archives, evidence remains. A restricted folder marked only with the word Ethiopia. Inside, unopened meetings, unshared translations, documents that were sealed and never revisited. Some say a later pope tried to restore the bond. Others say fear stopped him. Fear of what Ethiopia knew, of what they refused to erase. So the break was never spoken, but it was, and even now, it lingers, like a shadow between two churches that once shared a beginning, but chose different endings. In the year 1647, under the heavy sun of the Ethiopian highlands, a priest named Father Tesvi stood at the edge of a stone chapel, carved into a mountainside. He wore simple white linen. His cross was made of olive wood, worn smooth from years of prayer. Waiting at the edge of the clearing were two men dressed in black, Jesuits, sent from Rome. They had come with a message and an offer. They brought gifts, letters, sealed with wax, words written by cardinals, promises of education, gold, protection. The blessing of the Pope. They said Tesfi could become a bridge between two churches. All he had to do was let go of the old ways, close the Book of Enoch, accept the authority of Rome. But Tesfi didn't step forward. He said nothing. The younger Jesuit opened a leather-bound book and began to read verses from the Roman canon, passages removed from Ethiopian liturgy, generations earlier. Then came a list, books banned by Rome, but still read in Ethiopia. Jubilees, the Gospel of Mary, the story of the Watchers. When the reading stopped, Tesfi finally spoke. He said, "Scripture is not a wall, it's a well, and water doesn't flow from one place alone." He said the mountain they stood on had been holy long before Latin was spoken, that angels did not speak only in Rome's tongue, and that God had never asked him to choose. The older Jesuit warned him, said refusal could be seen as rebellion, reminded him of priests who had vanished, churches sealed without warning. He asked Tesfi if he was willing to risk everything, not just his life, but his soul. Tesfi looked out over the valley. Smoke rose in the distance. Villages where Jesuit missions had already replaced sacred texts. His people weren't afraid of war, they were afraid of forgetting, afraid of silence. So he answered, "I was baptized in water drawn from a stone basin above an angel's tomb," he said. "I have kissed manuscripts that glowed in candlelight, held a cross that bled in snow. I do not fear the Vatican, I fear forgetting who we are." The Jesuits left that night without a word. Weeks later the chapel was found empty, no struggle, no sign of flight, just a single page left on the altar, the ink still wet. It read, "The truth does not bend, it waits." Tesfi's name appears in no Vatican record, but in a monastery far from Rome his story is still told, not as rebellion, but as a reminder. Some priests do not vanish. Some walk deeper into the mystery, and leave the door open behind them. Just behind the northern wall of the Vatican, tucked quietly behind the colonnades of St. Peter's Square, stands a building most visitors never notice. Its stone glows warm in the Roman sun, the shutters stay closed, the doors never open to tourists. This is the Pontifical Ethiopian College, a spiritual home for a small number of Ethiopian priests who have studied within Vatican walls for generations. But beneath its chapel, under layers of stone and centuries of silence, there is a room that appears on no map. It wasn't always a secret. In the late 1800s, during renovations to expand the college, workers discovered a narrow staircase sealed by a wooden door. The priest overseeing the project, Abbé Johannes, told them not to open it until he had spoken with the Vatican Library. By morning the workers were gone. Not fired. Gone. No record. No address. No final payment. Years passed. Then, a young student named Daniel was assigned to sweep the lower crypts. He had been disciplined for speaking too openly about texts that weren't approved, like the Book of Enoch and the Kebra Naga. As he worked along the walls, his broom tapped against something hollow. A flagstone. Loose. Beneath it, a rusted key tied with leather. The tag read a single word. Abbé. He took it to his teacher, who stared at it for a long time. Then, without speaking, led Daniel behind a tapestry of Frumencius. There, hidden in the stone, was a door. The key turned once, the hinges moaned, and beyond was not a closet. It was a library, carved directly into the earth. The room was round, lined with wooden shelves cut into the stone. Scrolls lay brittle and bound in hide. Books stitched in palm leaves, languages no longer spoken, some never named. At the center was a single desk. A beam of light fell from a narrow hole above, illuminating one open manuscript. No one could date it. The ink was dark red. The letters were neither Ge'ez nor Latin. Some believed it was older than Aksum. Others said it was a translation from Jerusalem, carried before Rome ever sieged the city. Daniel was never seen again. Years later, when the door was opened, the manuscript was gone. But above the desk, carved into the stone, were 7 words. They buried the light so it would burn. The Vatican never confirmed the room's existence. But those who live inside the college sometimes speak of dreams, of voices, speaking in a tongue no one remembers, but everyone somehow understands. In a quiet reading room deep inside the Vatican Library, where the air carries the scent of wax and old parchment, there is a drawer that few know exists. It sits within a plain wooden desk far from the gilded halls and marble floors tourists imagine. Inside that drawer lies a book, unlike any other. Its cover is cracked. The pages curl slightly at the corners. But it's not the age that makes it strange, it's the script. The words inside aren't Latin, not Greek, not Hebrew, not even Ge'ez. The symbols drift like notes on a staff, not letters. Some resemble stars, others curve like flame, and faint lines between them give the impression of movement. Like the page itself is breathing. The book has no title, no author, no date of origin. But inside, tucked between the first and second pages, is a note, handwritten. It reads, "Believed to be in the language of angels." That phrase has haunted scholars for centuries. In the 1600s, a Jesuit named Father Niccolo Rinaldi found the book while cataloguing a shelf of unmarked texts. He recognized nothing, but the ink unsettled him. When held to candlelight, the symbols shimmered, only briefly, and only at the edge of vision. He brought it to his superior. The reply was simple: forgery. Ignore it. But Rinaldi couldn't. For weeks he worked by lamplight, copying each character by hand. He believed, perhaps foolishly, that if angels spoke, their language would follow mathematical rules. He counted shapes, tracked curves, prayed aloud. Then, one night, everything changed. Rinaldi was found at dawn, collapsed on the cold floor, still breathing, silent, his hands stained black with ink. Clutched in one fist was a torn scrap of parchment. 3 words, written in perfect script: "They answered me." He never wrote again. The book was sealed away. Some say it's buried beneath St. Peter. Others claim it's hidden in the Apostolic Archive, where even cardinals need permission to enter. Only a handful of cryptographers have studied it since. None have translated even a single line. But one thing remains: the ink, tested and retested, contains no iron, no plant or mineral trace. Under ultraviolet light, it glows, like moonlight reflected on water. Some whisper that it wasn't written, but sung into being, that it came not from a prophet, but from a voice heard in the dark. A language not meant to be read, but and those who feel it never forget. Late one night in the spring of 1954, a strange stillness settled over Vatican City. It wasn't the silence of peace or prayer. It was the kind that creeps in when something is slightly off. Vatican radio, usually broadcasting soft Latin hymns and distant bells, suddenly cut out. A priest had just begun to speak, Father Leone Ricci, when the audio snapped mid-sentence. For nearly 10 seconds, there was nothing, just static. Then came a sound no one could explain. At first, a low hum, rising, twisting into a sharp whistle. It crackled across the frequency like wind through a tunnel, and then beneath it, something stranger still, a voice, or many voices, layered, soft, almost whispering. Not Latin, not Italian, not any known tongue. The tone was slow, rhythmic, like a chant caught in an echo, and then, just as suddenly, the broadcast ended. Ricci never returned to the microphone. In fact, Ricci was never seen again. The official explanation was quick: technical malfunction. Vatican engineers issued a statement. A fuse had blown in the transmitter tower, causing interference with local frequencies, but outside of Rome, amateur radio operators claimed to have recorded the event. One man, Giorgio Vanni, brought his tape to a professor in Milan, an expert in ancient Semitic languages. The professor listened, stood up, and walked out without a word. He refused to speak about it, but later that year he published a brief academic paper on vocal structures in Eastern African liturgy. Privately, Giorgio said the voice repeated one word again and again, and then he believed it was in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language still used in Ethiopia. The word, Menelik. The Vatican never acknowledged the rumor, but a week after the broadcast, 2 Jesuits were sent to Ethiopia under diplomatic cover. Their mission was never logged. Ricci, the priest who vanished, was never found. Some say he had walked into the apostolic library just days before the incident, carrying a box of manuscripts, recently delivered from East Africa. Others believe he had been researching forbidden texts, connected to the Kebra Naga, and that he had made a connection the Vatican wanted buried. The Vatican radio tower never failed like that again, but on the anniversary of that night, radio enthusiasts still tune to the same frequency. Some claim they hear the hum return, soft, distant, not loud enough to understand, but just enough to wonder who or what was trying to speak. Far beneath the streets of Rome, below the marble floors and candlelit altars of Vatican City, there stretches a network of catacombs, narrow tunnels, carved long before basilicas rose. Once, They were hiding places, graves and shrines built in secret by early Christians. But one of those tunnels holds something stranger than bones. In the spring of 1926, a crew of Vatican workmen was assigned to reinforce a section of the lower catacombs near the old Aurelian Way. One of them, a quiet man named Pietro Duca, swung his pickaxe against what he thought was soft earth. Instead, the wall crumbled, revealing a narrow, sealed chamber. The air that escaped was thick, damp, and it carried the scent of parchment. Inside, resting on a single stone shelf, was a small scroll, bound tightly in faded red thread. Unlike the brittle Latin texts nearby, this scroll was wrapped in layers of cloth that showed no signs of age. Pressed into the outer wrap was a metal cross, odd in shape, nothing like the crosses of Western Christianity. Pietro, shaken, reported the discovery to his supervisor. Hours later, a black car arrived from the Vatican. The scroll was taken. Pietro never saw it again. He was reassigned to the gardens, retired 2 years later. But the story didn't end with him. Nearly 50 years later, in 1973, a scholar named Sister Antella, known for her work on early church manuscripts, found something unexpected, an uncatalogued entry in a leather-bound inventory deep within the Apostolic Archive. It referenced a scroll of unknown origin, described simply as Eastern, untranslatable, preserved by unknown means. No language was listed, but 2 words were underlined in faint ink: Gara and fireproof. That last word haunted. For centuries, only 2 things were said to survive fire without burning: blessings or curses. Sister Antella believed the scroll might be linked to the Abba Ema Gospels texts, said to have been written in a single day by a saint, guided by angel. When she requested access, her research permissions were revoked. No reason given. Some say the scroll speaks of a second covenant, one hidden from Rome. Others believe it describes Christ walking in lands the West never recorded, and some claim it was never meant to be found. Even now, those tunnels remain sealed, quiet, undisturbed, but somewhere in the dark, beyond that broken wall, a message may still be waiting, not written in Latin, not even in Jayas, but in something older, a voice meant not for the world that was, but for the one still to come. Hidden in a corner of the Vatican gardens, behind a curtain of ivy and the remains of old stone, stands a chapel that no longer welcomes visitors. Most have never heard of it. It doesn't appear on tourist maps. It carries no formal name. The doors haven't opened in over 100 years, but inside its crumbling walls lies one of the strangest things ever uncovered within Vatican grounds. A wall completely covered in symbols no one can read. The chapel was first documented in the late 1800s by a young archivist named Father Emilio Carrazza. He had been cataloguing minor religious buildings around St. Peter's Square when he stumbled across a faded sketch in the margin of an architect's notebook. The chapel was labeled simply Cappella dei Segni, the Chapel of Signs. When Father Emilio finally found it, he expected dust, silent, maybe a forgotten altar. He didn't expect what he saw. From floor to ceiling, the back wall glowed with symbols, spirals, uneven stars, branching lines that looked like roots or veins. There were no crosses, no saints, no halo, just shapes, layered, pulsing faintly in candlelight, as if they were painted with something no longer made. Some lines only appeared when seen from certain angles, revealing other layers beneath. He reported the discovery. Within a week, 2 scholars from the Pontifical Academy arrived. They stayed 3 days, said nothing. Then the chapel was sealed, padlocked, its key filed into a restricted archive. Father Emilio was transferred to Milan. Years later, a Jesuit mathematician named Brother Raphael de Fara found an old photograph of the wall, folded inside a forgotten archive box. He scanned the symbols into software he'd built to decode income scripts. The system crashed every time, at the same section. He said the patterns weren't random, but they weren't alphabetic either. What disturbed him most was a hand-drawn tracing he found with the photo. Someone had matched part of the wall to petroglyphs in the Ethiopian highlands near Lalibela. It wasn't a perfect match, but it was close enough. Some began to wonder, were the symbols not meant to be read, but prayed through? In 2003, a linguist granted rare access to the chapel said the wall faintly pulsed when she stood in silence. Her notes were never published. The Vatican refused to comment. Some believe the symbols form a language not lost, but waiting. Others say it's a map, or a warning, or a song in stone. No one agrees on what it means. And maybe that's exactly why it remains.